Journalism used to be a one-way street. Reporters and editors shared the news in formulaic, time-tested story formats. That was a great way to do things back in the 20th century, but conversation is the order of the day now. Mónica Guzmán and Moran are developing a new, more conversational style of journalism. In this episode, I talk with Mónica and Caitlin about their work at the Evergrey, a local Seattle community newsletter, and at Whereby US, that's the Evergrey's parent company, which operates similar publications around the United States.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 50 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy to observe this momentous episode, number 50, with two really great local journalists here in Seattle. Mónica Guzmán is she's now the VP of Local for Whereby US, which is an outfit down in based in Florida. But we'll let Mónica tell you a little bit more about that, her background there. But she's a really accomplished journalist. She's worked for the Seattle Times. She's been a columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review and just all kinds of other publications. She's been a Neiman Fellow, a super accomplished journalist. Moran, her colleague at Whereby US and the director or the local director for the Evergrey, the local publication, is joining us as well. And Caitlin has sort of a balance between conventional journalism, working at newspapers, but also a lot of digital work and a lot of local work. And the reason I asked them both on today, well, first, let me have you talk a little bit more about yourselves, just so the folks have a good feel for you. And then I want to get into why I invited you on the show today. So, Mónica, why don't you go first?
Cool. So I just recently stepped into a role as Vice President of Local at Whereby Us. So Whereby Us publishes 5 newsletter platform communities in growing cities around the country. It's Seattle, Miami, Orlando, Portland, and Pittsburgh. And so there's teams of really amazing entrepreneurial journalists working on ways to help urban locals make the most of their cities. I co-founded the Evergrey, which Caitlin is now running. And it's been a really interesting adventure the last 3 years. And like you said, I've been a journalist for 15 years, which is a really long time when I say it out loud. That's wild. Holy crap. Mostly in Seattle, but, interested in just trying to get to the heart of things and very much trying to engage audiences, which I know Caitlin is also very much interested in, and we've has done some work in. So turn it over to her.
Cool. Caitlin.
Yeah, so I think Mónica laid out what the Evergrey and Whereby Us is about pretty well, but I'm taking over this week as local director of the Evergrey, which I'm super excited about. My background started in traditional media. I worked for a number of newspapers out on the East Coast before coming back to Seattle. And when I got back, I started working for Patch, which was a network of hyperlocal websites that went away and then has kind of been resurrected since that time. But that's where I kind of dove into all the digital audience building and social media and all those good things. And then went on to work for the Seattle Times and be the first engagement editor of their Education Lab project. So that was an interesting role where I was kind of mixing my traditional newspaper chops with a lot of the audience engagement and development work. And yeah, I've been at Whereby Us for a little over 6 months now at this point.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for coming on. And the reason I ran into Mónica at a networking event a month or two ago, and it came up, I think it was when Caitlin was first, anyhow, it was the first event I saw the two of you had together, and I was like, wait, what? There's been this transition? I read the Evergrey every day. I think a lot of people in Seattle do. I don't know what your readership is now, but I was really surprised that there had been that big a change in the editorial staff there, because I didn't perceive any change in my daily news consumption experience at the Evergrey. So I would love to hear how what voice and tone editorial magic is going on back there, that you organize and manage things in a way that a clueless reader like me is completely, just it's truly the voice of the publication, not of any one person there. How do you make that happen?
Caitlin, do you remember when you even started to write the Evergrey, like fully? When was that?
Gosh, I want to say March or April, but before that, I was kind of pitching in here and there, especially with the news roundup section. So it was a gradual process.
It's a difficult question to answer, because while we are deliberate within the company about what our voice and tone is, there's also quite a bit of freedom for each writer to interpret those values that we try to hit in their own way. And if you read the different newsletters across our cities, they sound very much like whatever their city sounds like. So there is a Seattle component to the Evergrey voice. I'll say that, me and my co-founder, Annika Anand, worked very hard on the voice when we started the Evergrey, with kind of an acknowledgement that, information is out there. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of dense information, but a lot of what's needed is access, a way to get information that's actually easy to digest. So from that came this, experimentation with a voice that Whereby Us also tries to, have and embed into everything it does. And it's very conversational. So we work on a couple of elements that I'll highlight very quickly. And then Caitlin, I'd love for you to jump in and talk about how you, see these. But we look at things like clarity of meaning. So there's a way in which the Evergrey is fairly popular with newcomers, but also with people who, may not be the biggest wonks in the city. We try to start where people are, and we try to stay very, very clear about meaning, staying away from jargon and things like that. There's a very conversational tone. The beginning of every Evergrey, it's like a little hello, and at the end, we're like, have a nice day. There's always some way of saying that in a very friendly, personal tone. We try to be delightful, even when, the news or what's going on isn't always happy. We try to keep that light sort of energetic kind of tone to what we do. And we think about what I sometimes phrase as light cognitive load, not a lot of long sentences, not a lot of huge big words and prepositional clauses that you trip over and makes it so you have to read a sentence 5 times to understand what it says. So that's just a couple. There's a lot more than to it than that. But I'll let Caitlin weigh in.
Yeah, I would just say, from a traditional media background, the way that journalists have tended to interact with readers has been very one way. It's been, here's what's happening, we present it to you, you take it, you consume it, maybe you write a letter to the editor the next day, but that's pretty much the end of the transaction. And I think what's so great about the Evergrey and our sister publications is that we really don't see the conversation as ever being completely finished. We're open to readers replying to us and say, hey, you missed this one, aspect of the conversation. You forgot to include this perspective. And we can constantly kind of update where we're going with things. And I would also say that Monica mentioned delightful. That's a really big one for me. And I think that every day I try to include at least one thing that's just fun or clever, or, just kind of a lighter, non-serious kind of note on things. Because I want people to feel like when they open the email every day that there's something that they're just going to feel good about.
Right. I'm curious how you acquired that skill base, Caitlin. Like, was there, and Monica chime in too. Is there like a formal training thing or documentation, or how is this lore passed on from generation to generation in your newsroom?
Well, we did develop a style guide, and that was a process that I was helping lead kind of in earlier in the year. And that was really helpful for me because I was able to tap each of the local directors in each of our markets and kind of get their take on what are like the groundwork, what's the groundwork of their writing style. So we talked about things like emojis and acronyms and kind of like the nitty gritty of what we do and why we do it. And I think that process was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and Monica, I'm curious, especially about I hadn't really, I'm embarrassed to admit, I hadn't really thought about the Where By Us connection and how it might fit into all this. So is there a common voice and tone and approach across the publications, or is there a real focus on localizing as much as possible?
So the style guide process is a good kind of proxy for this. There are principles that we try to hit in our voice and tone that are across the board on Where By Us. Try to being conversational, being friendly, being welcoming, being warm, being energetic, and things like that. But there are a bunch of, words, phrases, attitudes that influence tone. How you talk about homelessness in Seattle. There's a set of unspoken guidelines around that, right? That if you are a journalist in the city, you have absorbed, and you probably wouldn't think to write down. We've written them down. And then other cities have a couple of things they're looking to do. And the brands also have their own sort of posture within their cities that they've tried to articulate in the style guides. So the Evergrey wants to have a welcoming, inclusive posture that tries to set the table for lots of perspectives that can be challenging, in a couple of ways. But yeah, we think about language a lot, and we give folks like space to experiment with it. And as Caitlin said, it's all a conversation with our community. So for example, I'll give this as an example. Several weeks ago, somebody wrote in about some place where we had used the word tribe. I think it was actually a partner event listing. So one of our partner events was doing something where they used the word tribe, and it wasn't in the connotation of Native American tribes, but there's a conversation in Seattle and really everywhere about certain words that have taken on certain, connotations and meanings that might be, might just not be like great toward a certain group. And this is obviously a really interesting time to be alive right now with these kinds of conversations. So we made the decision to no longer use that word. And in fact, inside Where By Us, we made some changes to that as well. So each city also has to listen to its own community and see where language is and where attitudes and approaches are and how we speak about each other. That is incredibly important. The Evergrey tries this a lot, but we all do. We try very hard to speak, in a way that makes everyone feel like they're part of their city. And what that means in each city is different.
Got it. And I really appreciate that it's more of a process than like a style guide. A lot of people think, oh, that's done, and you just put it down and there's your document that you refer to. But that's not at all how you work. It's a very dynamic document. I'm curious, you talked about this sort of you're effing the ineffable. I think so. The articulating the unwritten rules. Is that an ongoing thing? Is there sort of an ongoing attention and awareness to that and attempts to pin it down in your style guide?
Caitlin, do you want to speak to that?
I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, but...
Well, just how those unwritten rules are eventually codified, if they are, because I think that's super interesting that there's a lot of, we're so divided right now, and that certain words can trigger people one way or the other. And so having a style that accounts for that, but still conveys the underlying essence of that archaic term that doesn't do the job anymore. Anyhow, my perception is you all do a good job of that, but I'm just trying to figure out how that, does it remain an unwritten rule, or at some point do these things get written down somewhere?
No, they do get written down. We use Slack, which is a tool to communicate with each other since we're remote across the country. And, that's kind of like the first draft often of where we're raising these concerns. But then, it all gets documented in our internal documents. And, that's so that we don't, constantly come across the same things and not have resolution on them. We're a small team, so we need to reach consensus and move beyond things kind of as quickly as possible.
Yep. No, Slack, I'm in probably 20 Slacks. So it's a great way to do that kind of stuff. Hey, I wanted to, so the subject of conversation has come up a bunch. That's your thing at the Evergrey. And I think that's a huge difference between the Seattle Times and other conventional publications that you've come from. Maybe start with Mónica about how it seems like you were doing that right out of the gate, that's always been an intention. I mean, it seems like you've really mastered it. Can you talk about how, whether you personally, either in both of you, if you had any personal challenges in adapting from kind of conventional journalism like broadcasting to a more conversational model? Maybe talk just a bit about that. Was that a challenge for you, or are you both kind of native to this conversation, of the new conversational way of doing journalism?
That's a great question. Early on in my career, I was in a place where suddenly it's like, oh, it's make a blog, figure out this whole blog thing. And so it felt like I had a bit of an early start on that, sort of breaking with that. And I remember it being somewhat challenging, but because I was so young, I hadn't really gotten all that accustomed to conventional journalism writing. So I guess that's lucky. I'm not sure. But it's gotten to the point where I've done it for long enough that it feels somewhat natural. And the reason, that it was there from the beginning of the Evergrey, and the reason Whereby Us is such a great, parent company for the Evergrey, and also kind of helps all these other publications, that is again, this idea that, when you're conversational, more people can follow and feel welcome, and feel like they can participate. There's a posture you set, right, when you sound like somebody across the coffee table from you. Whereas if you are writing in a more traditional journalistic sense, maybe the first 2 paragraphs, a lot of people have no idea what you mean by Initiative 4235. Like, what do they mean? This representative, what did they do? I'm so lost already. And by the end of the second paragraph, I feel like this isn't for me. So we try, it comes from this place of trying to be welcoming, and being conversational is it's just the way our brains are wired to, accept information easily. So,
yeah, Caitlin, your thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I mean, I think it's been a challenge for me. I guess I maybe got a little more steeped than Monica in the traditional reporting and writing styles. But I did work at the Seattle Times on a couple newsletters, so I got a little bit of a head start before coming to the Evergrey as well. But yeah, I think, we've established some good baseline principles of like avoiding jargon, keeping sentences short. And those are things that I think about every day. And in my mind, I just really imagine that I'm writing this as an email to a friend, and, how would I phrase things in that context, instead of thinking about, oh, I'm writing a story in the traditional sense.
Got it. Hey, just a quick aside, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but in terms of tools for doing that, I've become a big fan of the Hemingway app, and even Grammarly a little bit, but there's a lot of gadgetry out there now to help keep your writing tight and accessible. Is this more like just your professional chops being cultivated, or do you have any tools that help you accomplish this accessible writing style?
Caitlin, can you think of a tool we use to automate this?
No, I do Google puns sometimes, though, about a given topic. They don't all just come from the top of my head.
Yes.
No. I mean, I do Google vocabulary words a fair amount. Just like you would use a traditional dictionary or thesaurus, to kind of get my brain working in that way. I mean, I think the principles of traditional journalism writing aren't all bad. Concision and precision has always been a part of it. So it's not like we have to completely reinvent the wheel here. There's just certain things that need to be adjusted.
Right, but you can be concise and precise without being aloof and snooty, or
exactly.
not that that's. I actually know a lot of old school journalists who I wouldn't exactly classify them that way, but there was sort of a not an ivory tower, but something analogous to that, just sort of like a knowledge imparted and the earnest, anyhow, that's a thing, and you're the antithesis of that, which I think is probably why you're so successful. That accessibility. Hey, I wanted to ask, the other thing, part of this conversation is you do a lot of events, and that's something that I don't know how common that is in the conventional journalism world, but how important are these events? If you're conversational, it seems like being out in the world is an important part of that. Is that why you do events, or how does the event stuff fit into the Evergrey and the Whereby Us plan?
Well, I'll start, but definitely want to hear Caitlin on this as well. So for the Evergrey, the person who runs that for the Evergrey is Jordan Lyon, who is really talented at thinking about how interpersonal connections and relationships get built when you are co-present, basically. And he's got a real passion for it that I think has benefited the Evergrey quite a bit. It's like I at least see it sort of part and parcel to what we're trying to do with our content, and trying to take it away from just words on a screen, right? Like when we get conversational and try to build connections and relationships around it, being in person is very, very powerful. So one of the ways I'll speak to the Evergrey talks about making the most of our city and connecting you to each other and to your city. So connection and relationship is really important. One of the things that the villains that keeps popping up in the narrative of Seattle that you'll read about in the Evergrey is the Seattle freeze, which is this idea that people are just cold with each other and don't get warm enough to build, relationships that have real meaning to people. And whereby us generally, like one of those sort of hypotheses we operate under is that you can build a better connection with your city if you build connections with the people in it. If you're actually finding a local, meaningful thing, that you're doing. You've made a friend, you're a regular at this coffee shop because you know the barista, you join a neighborhood dog walking group, whatever it is. So events are incredibly important for that because, we know the limits of the internet. We've been with social media for like 15 years. We know it's not everything it was baked, it was like made out to be, right? It's really wonderful. It makes great connections. But the stuff that really means a lot to your life is the thing that you feel you're grounded on and that you can look around wherever you happen to be and like shake someone's hand and like have a drink or like share some experience. So that's at least some of the philosophical underpinning behind events, but there's a million other ways to talk about it. So Caitlin, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think events are a crucial way to close that kind of loop between reader and, journalist or writer, or whatever we want to call ourselves these days. It's a way for us to put action behind what we're putting out to the community and give them an opportunity to take the conversation that we're having in the digital space and do something about it. And, I think a key part of what the Evergrey and the rest of our sister publications are after is not just, clicks or opens or those kind of quantitative data, but also the qualitative impacts. And in-person meetings are a big way of how you get there, how relationships are formed, how people feel empowered to do something about what they're reading in our newsletters. So I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, you just mentioned, kind of both quantitative and qualitative evaluations of what you do. I perceive you as being successful, and it sounds like you perceive yourselves as being. How do you measure success at the Evergrey? What are those quantitative measures? What are the qualitative things you're looking at?
Well, quantitatively, open rates are a key metric for us because it basically tells us, who's coming back every day and viewing us as an essential part of their routine. So that's definitely a big one for us. Qualitative wise, anytime we get a message from someone in the community who says, oh, because of you, I went out and tried this new thing. I met this new person. I took some action that, I wouldn't have had the knowledge to take otherwise. That's definitely one of the biggest signs of success for us.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have, thanks to Annika Anand, she was really instrumental in forming this for all of Whereby Us. We have our local impact reports and ways that there's actually a Slack bot, and you go into our Slack and you hit /impact, and then this little form pops up and asks you all these questions about what was the impact, what kind of impact was it, increasing belonging, was it a reader action, was it an influencer sort of doing something as a result of what we do. And so, so we have a whole spreadsheet with the impacts that have been collected from across the country, and that helps us see where what we do resonates, and hopefully makes us smarter about doing more of those things.
Interesting. Does that, are you starting to see any patterns emerging, like any differences regionally or common things that come up, or?
I can speak to, I think one of the great things about working at a Whereby Us publication is there's quite a bit of local love for the brand. And so I remember, sometimes more legacy media, maybe didn't do as good of a job cultivating that kind of productive conversation. And so a lot of what you hear from folks is negative. like tons of negative comments coming into newspaper websites, things like that. So what we hear a lot of is just general appreciation that sometimes gets kind of snuck in to something else. Someone asks a question about membership and then says, by the way, like, I read y'all every day. This is awesome. It helps me get up in the morning. It helps me feel like I can, do something cool today or this week or whatever. Like, these are the things we've done. So it's been really nice to see that like love for our cities is one of the ways that we connect with people in them.
Nice. You just mentioned, quickly, I want to just another observation between legacy media and the current mode that you're operating in. Like, it used to be that, like, the common way to interact in the old days was like a letter to the editor. And those were always the kind of like snarky and zingers and muck and, just like you were just saying, like a more negative interaction. I'm just wondering if you have any concerns that, like, to the extent that I've seen interactions, it seems all very positive and productive. But I wonder if, by being so accessible, like that if there was some benefits to that aloof, know-it-all stuff, to be more like objective, and because that's one of the hallmarks of old journalism. That's how I was trained. I went to journalism school in the 80s, and it was the Chinese wall between advertising and editorial, the sort of the institutionalized aloofness of how you did journalism back then. Do you think we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in any respects, or is it generally positive change?
I feel like, a lot of those principles came from a good place, but they're just not practical in today's world, either because, of the internet and how we all communicate, or just the fact that, I think we've realized that true objectivity doesn't really exist. We all come from a place where we have certain biases and experiences. And I think the more we can be open and honest about that and say, this is who I am, this is what I think, but I'm open to learning more and, reevaluating my position. I think that's the best way forward.
Nice.
Yeah, to add on to that, I completely agree. I think transparency is sort of the only way you can do it now. I think it's also, to frame it another way, in the past, because it wasn't a conversation, journalism was mostly, I'm informing you. I'm going and I'm doing the work that you can't as easily do and you can't really participate, and now I'm going to tell you stuff. The role of the journalist was informant, right? Like source of things, reporter of the stuff. Now, because so much of it is conversation and so much truth and truthiness and untruths are spreading in the conversations of social media, whether journalists like it or not, journalists can't specifically solely be informants anymore. We also have to be mediators and sense makers, but mediators and moderators of the broader conversation. When you adopt the role of a mediator and moderator, but you are so transparent that you say, I believe these things, and that's it. It's like, I imagine like an event where there's a moderator of a focus group or some disagreement in the room. It's probably not a great way for that moderator to open up the conversation by saying, okay, we've got this side and we've got this side. I agree with this side. Let's begin the mediation. So in other words, I think there's sort of a new understanding of the role of moderator and mediator that is happening in some places, where if there's a commitment to helping make sense of the community's conversation, then there can be sort of a new set of professional constraints or professional sort of actions that we take in order to do that role well. But it depends on how much you see yourself as an informant, an analyst, a moderator, a mediator. There's sort of like every journalist has to make their own decisions about what roles they play and how they will behave in order to achieve the outcomes they want for each of those roles.
Right. And that used to be so clear cut, and now it's not. And there's huge benefit to that, I think. Anyhow, I want to observe, we're coming up on time. I want to make sure I always give my guests an opportunity. Is there anything that hasn't come up in the conversation yet, or that's just on your mind about conversational journalism or voice and tone and all that stuff that hasn't come up? Anything from either of you? And you don't have to.
I would just say it's always evolving. That's the nature of conversation. Look at how much change we've seen in the last decade or two. And I think a key part of it for me is just being open to whatever comes next and not feeling like, oh, I've figured it all out. I've learned everything. That's it. we just have to stay nimble and open to whatever's coming down the road.
Yeah, back when I was trained, I think there was an assumption like, yep, you can figure this stuff out. And I really enjoy this refreshing, nope, you're never going to know anything, maybe, and certainly not everything. So,
yeah. It's
Monica.
scary. It's totally scary. I mean, I think a lot of journalists in their heart of hearts, are feeling some anxiety around how little is for sure, and how little of our craft is something you can read about in a textbook, get trained on in school. Society is changing all around us, and it's kind of like a dark place to go to and talk about, but it's true. And like the way we communicate, what technology has done to the way we communicate, who we trust and who we don't trust, and the lack of faith in institutions. I mean, it just gets dark fast. So, what are journalists and content providers going to do in such a time when we're all overwhelmed with content? It's coming at us all the time. What do we truly want to pay attention to? What truly gives us value and helps us live our lives? And what does that even mean these days?
Exactly.
It's a big, big thing.
Hey, I know you didn't mean to do this, Monica, but you just put a great little bookend on episode number 50 here, because my very first conversation was with Hanson Hossein. That was episode number 1. And he talked about, he's a journalist and a journalism educator. And he talked about, do we really need any more stories? That was why I invited him on the show. And so I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Well, thanks so much to both of you. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks, Larry.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.